There's a lot of chatter about Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference, and I recently finished watching it, and I can understand. I thought it was a very powerful speech. It was uh, more or less, it was a good speech. There were some elements I wasn't a big fan of. I continue to take issue with the idea that supranational organizations like the UN can be reformed, which is what he believes. But the thing that I really enjoyed about it, the element, and I think this is the most important element of it, is that he reminded the Europeans that they are part of a great heritage, and that it would be foolish to forget that, and it would be foolish to be ashamed of who they are. And I think this is a theme that needs to be reiterated and echoed because we have a problem in the West, and it affects obviously America here as well. There's been a campaign, and I wholeheartedly believe it's an intentional campaign to shame the cultures of Western civilization into not being who they are, into turning on themselves, into becoming a culture of suicide. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that in the policies. We're seeing it in the self hate of our younger generations. We're hearing it through the garbage that's coming out through academia and things like that. And we're seeing it again through the policies, most visibly being the ones where they're letting in a deluge of other civilizations, third world civilizations, come in and basically dilute the great European civilizations. Now, the way that partly that has been able to happen, of course, is because when you talk like this, they make it sound like it's racist. They're like, it's so racist to say the great European civilizations and to be proud of being European. And they say it's akin to being proud of being white, which I don't know that that's any huge problem either, because everyone should be proud of what they are. God made them that way. And somehow they created this dichotomy, this paradigm in which the only people who can't be proud of who they are white Europeans. And that's insane because I'm a white European. I was actually born in Romania, whatever. I like to brag that, we came from, we're descendants of Roman conquerors, which we are and whatnot. It doesn't mean I hate anyone else. It doesn't mean that I think other cultures are lower or whatever, but I do think European culture is awesome. I am proud to be European. I'm glad maybe that way. If you would have made me Ethiopian, I would have been Ethiopian. I saw this great documentary the other day, and I learned, actually, I think I've known, but I was reminded that Ethiopia has one of the largest Christian, the oldest Christian heritage over there, and that's where actually I think they preserve the Book of Enoch and whatever. I was like, well, that's cool, you know. And so for people who've traveled here and there, or there maybe they've had a lot of contact with different cultures, I, we can all appreciate other cultures while being proud, but not sinfully proud, but proud as in where, Jesus tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? So obviously, what he's insinuating there, part of what he's saying is you love yourself. This command is based on the assumption that you understand that you should love yourself in the sense that you should respect yourself. You should see the value in yourself, not because you gave you value, but because God gave you value. And so God gave us this value. He made Paul, and he made my wonderful wife, Teresa, and my amazing son, Lucas. And then he made a bunch of the people I go to church with, and he made everyone I go to church with. He made other people I've worked with or whatever, people from other countries, people from here or whatever. And so he's saying, I made you for a reason. I want you to acknowledge your value. So that means there's an element of self-love. And so I think that of course stretches out to nations and peoples. The Bible talks about nations quite a lot. And never, ever, ever does it insinuate that the nations, that ethnicities, that different groups will ever cease to exist. For instance, I'm going to give you two prophecies, kind of, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament, of course. So in Isaiah 2:4, he talks about what the coming afterlife kingdom. This is a kingdom that will be ruled by Jesus. This is generally understood all throughout the Bible. That's what we're looking forward to. And that's we will live in a monarchy. so to speak, in the afterlife. But fortunately, it's going to be a monarchy ruled by Jesus. And there's no better way. If you can have a perfect king, then that's apparently the best system. So in Isaiah 2:4, it talks about this coming kingdom. And he says before that, it says, he being God, he will judge between the nations and he'll settle disputes. This is God in that at that time. He's saying he would judge between the nations and he'll settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords in the plowshares and their plowshares and their spears in the pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So the idea is the afterlife, you're going to have the nations. You're going to have diversity. You're going to have these people. That's what true diversity is, right? So then Revelation 7:9, it says, after this is John, this is another vision he sees here. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation and people and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So as we go into heaven through the judgment, the nations will be still broken into nations, and it's not broken. We'll be that's how it's laid out. So God seems to have seen, he values the diversity, and you could tell with nature, there's all these sorts of different animals and whatever. God loves diversity. He sees it. You see it in the animal kingdom. You see it, in the environment, where all the different trees. The more country I've gotten, the more I've come to really appreciate various trees and shrubs and all sorts of, like my wife, she loves, she's getting excited because she loves gardening, and she was out buying some bushes, and I'm excited. I'm going to have a pecan nut tree, and we bought some blueberry bushes and things like that. So we like God, everywhere where his hand is, there's diversity. Where there isn't diversity, and this is how you can tell this attempt to basically create this homogenous, technocratic, one world government. This is satanic. This is how you can tell, because they're basically there's an attempt to homogenize the world. They're trying, first and foremost, the major target of the globalists is Western civilization. And that's because it has it has some major attributes that get in the way of creating a homogenous, technocratic, totalitarian, one world government. And so, for instance, the first and very main obstacle, and this has always been the case, is Christianity. Christianity cannot coexist with a one world totalitarian system where the state is called to be the God. Okay, you can see this with communism. Communism is the best example, is the best microcosmic example or smaller example of what a one world technocratic totalitarian system would be like. They do not suffer challenges. They do not suffer competition. And in a statist government, whether it be just one communist country or the whole world in it, if you have Christians, what you will have is you'll have a divided loyalty. And that's why statists always hate Christianity. It's why the Nazis, it's why the communists, it's why the CCP, the Chinese communist government over there is attacking churches, and they surveil them, and they go in and they tear down their buildings, and they break up their meetings and things like that. This is it's pretty universal. Totalitarianism does not suffer Christianity. And there's also the argument to make that it doesn't suffer any religion. Speaking of the Chinese, they're very hard on the Uyghurs, who are a Muslim minority and whatnot. But the idea is that what we're seeing with the attack on Western civilization, what we are really seeing is an attack on Christendom, because that's really at the heart of this. Because people are wondering, it's like, well, they're flooding in all these people in Europe, and they were flooding all these people in America. It's like, what does Europe and America have in common? Well, they have this really robust Christian heritage, this tradition, and so that has to go. So that's definitely a problem for the globalists. The other thing The other attribute of Western civilization that they really, really hate, and that's really an obstacle, are these principles that we have of self government and liberty. So we have these crazy ideas that were born in Europe. They started in Greece, they moved over westward. The English really refined it. And then over here in America, we made it even better. The Americans made it even better. It's like it exploded. And then all of a sudden we had democracies, as they call them, all over the world. I like to say that, we had, the idea of self government really started trending after the War of Independence here in America. Well, again, that's a problem. If you're trying to build a one world system that is almost surely wholeheartedly going to be totalitarian. We saw a glimpse of that during COVID. The WHO, which is under United Nations, they were dictating medical policies, or basically public policies for all of Europe. That's why you saw such uniformity. They affected us here to some degree too. But the reason you saw all this uniformity is because you have all these supranational organizations who were pushing down on individual states of how to carry out their public policy. Now, I remember I did some hearings. I did some reporting on some hearings sometime afterwards, and there were people from various countries and various realms of expertise who were talking about what they see. And one of the people that was at this hearing, and I think it was hosted by Dr. Robert Malone, who I've been privileged to meet, was a Romanian. And so the whoever was hosting the forum, I think it was Ron Johnson, he had mentioned something about how Romania had like one of the lowest vaccine input rates out of all Europe, and this was at the peak. And he's like, well, how did you guys do it? And so he basically said that what happened is when they started seeing the European commissars come and tell the Romanian leaders to impose lockdowns, to make everyone try to get the vaccines, well, they asked for, and this was still not good enough, but it was still, the Rangers like, well, what's the science? What's the basis here? Why are we doing this? What do you guys know? We're really curious, because if we're going to tell people this, we need to tell them what's behind it. And they didn't give them anything other than the fact that this is what everyone is doing, which is really weird. And based on the telling of this gentleman from Romania, they didn't provide any robust qualifications for why they should basically put everyone on house arrest and make them take this new technology, jam it in their bodies. And so the Romanians were like, well, that doesn't work. You guys sound like the old commies, and we're still alive. We just basically beat the commies. We had a revolution to kill the commies and to dislodge them from control over our lives. And now you're coming here and you kind of sound like them. So they're like, no, we're not going to do that. So way to go, Romania, my people. My ancestors. I'm really proud about that. But so going back, speaking of ancestors, descendants of whatnot, Marco Rubio goes to Germany, and there's two main takeaways. The other one that everyone is talking about is the fact that Marco Rubio seemed to be saying, telling them, reassuring them that America's not leaving Europe. It's not turning on Europe. And, he said things like, we in America have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West managed decline. That was him kind of chiding them. But he says, for us Americans, our home may be in the Western Hemisphere, but we will always be a child of Europe. And he made various comments, and he told great stories about basically the fact that America is a child of Europe. He talked about, how there's all these elements of American identity that come from various places in Europe. Of course, there's the major English contribution. There's the French fur traders who went out into the frontier. There's a Scotch Irish who pushed the frontier. There's, of course, the Germans who were in the Midland there, in the heartland, who came and they farmed and they built the breadbasket of the country. Things like that. And so it's like he goes on, and Spain, their contribution was this, and the English and the Germans, and and it's like that was his way of saying we are a composite of all you guys. And so they really liked it. There were like 3 standing ovations and whatnot. And then he said something to the degree that, what we're undergoing here, we're going and under a renew and restoration. Under his exact words were, under President Trump, the United States will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration. And he said, and while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe. And then he kind of chided them for the reckless um, migration policies, where again they're still importing the whole third world, which again is leading to what they said in one of their strategy manuals, civilizational erasure. And that is what's happening. That's what's happening here. And I guess the Europeans are too proud to understand it, but I don't think that's what's going on. I mean, the people understand it. And I think there is an element of naivety, at least in what he's saying publicly, that being Marco Rubio. I don't know if they know that this is on purpose, but they can certainly see that this has been facilitated by the UN leaders, the EU leaders, and things like that. Everyone knows that's the case. The individual countries are complaining about it. So that's certainly happening. Um, and he understands that and he's telling them that. So I hope that there's going to be some change in there, because what happens in Europe is very important, because Europe is kind of like a harbinger of what comes here, and it's going to be more difficult for us to fight off the globalist march over the world if Europe falls. And Europe is very close to falling. But I want to kind of go back to this idea of national pride, of ethnic pride, which apparently, again, the only people who aren't allowed to do it are those of European descent. But you know, let's face it, over the last few thousand years, the Europeans have done a lot of amazing things. And since that's where my blood is, I'm gonna say that the Europeans have probably made the most amazing contributions in all of history. But I'm biased. Again, the Arabs gave us math, and that was fantastic, and that was way a long time ago. There were various other contributions from the Asians and whatnot, certainly, and I'm not going to argue that. But again, I'm partial. I'm European. And I think it's time, especially since this culture is in a little bit of a self crisis, where we're undergoing a self esteem issue. It's time to kind of rehash the greatness of European culture. First of all, again, democracy, as they call it, we'll just call it self government. That's where it came from. There was no self government. The ideas, these things weren't happening until the Europeans started talking about it. First, it was the Greeks. And, by today's standards, it wouldn't necessarily be considered freedom, because, the Greeks were kind of like, if you're a landowner, you get to come make decisions, which was different from the way that things had been. But nevertheless, it was a step in that direction. And like I said, by the time it got all the way westward to the English had really one up that. And so then let me get this real quick. All right. Sorry. So what happened? Yes. So self government comes from Europe. Let's be honest about that. Another thing that comes from Europe is, I don't know, abolishment of slavery. That's a big one. And the really weird thing about it is we're the ones who are getting all the crap for it. The Americans, especially, but Europe in general. All they ever talk about is the slave trade when this country started. But you know what? Slavery was happening for thousands of years everywhere. Every nation had done. Every culture had participated in it, and it came in various forms. You had the chattel slavery, which is what the one we talk about most, but there was other kinds of slavery. People had tutors as slaves. They had various workers as slaves. They had, educators as slaves and whatnot. So there are all sorts of slaves, but it's something that was practiced forever. And then William Wilberforce gets this crazy idea, and it starts in England, and then it starts spreading. And it is just recently that slavery, which has existed since the beginning of time, was abolished. And why did that happen? Because the Europeans said it is time to end this. Okay. And then you can go through all Europe. You can look at the magnificent architecture. Again, I happen to think that European architecture is the pinnacle of human design. I wholeheartedly believe that. I don't think anyone who who go to Sistine Chapel or the Cathedral of Notre Dame or anything like. I mean, you can just go even Buckingham Palace, and I mean, there's just and you see all these beautiful castles all throughout Europe and whatnot. There's just something that's really beautiful about that, and so that's certainly something that we should be proud of, you know. And then you have amazing music, classical music. You have Mozart and Bach and so many others. You have French cooking. Me and my wife, we kind of go back and forth. It's like which nationality has like the best cooking, you know? And so I I tend to lean towards the French as much as our family, or I don't, but Teresa and Lucas, they really like pasta and they like so they lean a little more toward the Italian because those are seem to be the two major competing ones. But I'm more on the French side because I feel like there's more diversity there. But technically, I mean, when I eat, I think I probably eat more like a Romanian and a German because I like brats and I like pickled stuff and and I like a good beer every once in a while. I like good beer, you know. So I've gotten to live in some states where I've developed an appreciation for good beer. You know, as a Christian, you're not like supposed to necessarily, especially as a Baptist, they don't like to admit that they drink beer. Some of them don't. Whatever. I think it's all kind of stupid because the Bible says it talks about not getting drunk. I like the taste of beer, and I don't ever have enough to get drunk. I just like good IPAs, good pilsners, things like that. And there is an element of it that's actually good for your gut, again, in moderation. And so I'm a pretty moderate guy. I have control, self-control, and so I don't have to worry about whatever, drinking too much or anything. I'm not 16 anymore or whatever. So I can go on and on about all the amazing things that that Europe has contributed, but I'll just kind of leave it at that because I want to. That was my big point. I was very happy to hear what he was saying. It was touching, and it was a very well written speech, and I hope to see a resurgence. And I know that in Europe there already is. You can't see it being reflected in among the elite class, but there is an emergence of people all over Europe who have had enough of being flooded and having their civilizations diluted. They should not be the only people who can't be proud of who and what they are, and basically be afraid to say that we cannot have our civilization destroyed. We must preserve who we are. Again, and this is the way I always test this. I always put these ideas to the test of the greatest, what I consider the anchor, the gauge, the major gauge. And so my gauge for anything here is the Bible. And I see the Bible here. I see God preserving ethnicities, the nations. And so I think we should as well. I think it's great. He does other weird things, and you're kind of like, well, he really does like something like food, right? We go to heaven and there's a big feast. We know that in the afterlife, our bodies will be redeemed, and we don't necessarily need food, but he made it to where either we'll need it or we'll have it just for fun and whatnot. There's going to be some carryover. And part of that carryover is going to be the nations because God loves diversity. And he made every culture, he made it beautiful in its own way. But over the last few decades or whatever, there's been a satanic attempt to tell us that this culture specifically, European culture specifically, is not worth preserving. And that's a damn lie from the pit of hell. And we need to reject that.